Hello, my name is Keith Nelson, and today I'll be talking about the racial and gender discrimination that was found in the Baltimore Police Department. I'll take you through a quick history of the Baltimore Police Department. I will walk you through a Department of Justice investigation that was made to look into unlawful and unconstitutional practices made by the Baltimore Police Department. I'll talk about the results and some statistics that came out of that investigation. Then I'll talk about the communication barriers that led the department to how it got to these results and through this investigation, where it is today, as well as solutions to these communication barriers and how to execute them as well. First, I wanted to take you through a brief history of the Baltimore Police Department. The department was founded in 1853 when Baltimore was one of, if not the biggest city in the United States, with the Inner Harbor being a very big place for imports and exports. And the department was actually run through the U.S. military until 1862, right after the Civil War. The first black officers were introduced in 1938, which is actually before most other cities in America, especially southern states, but black police officers could not wear police uniforms until 1943, 5 years after they were introduced. I have a quote from the Police Commissioner of Baltimore, Donald Pomerleau, from 1968, that describes Baltimore as the most corrupt and antiquated city in the nation and has developed almost no positive relationship with the city's Negro community. As I'll get into later, Baltimore is about 66%, about 60 to 66% African American. So obviously, this quote is very telling of what has happened to this police department. I wanted to get into Bishop L. Robinson, who became the first black police commissioner for Baltimore in 1984. He was known to other officers as what they could be, other African American officers, excuse me, as what they could be by joining the department in 1952, earned the rank of sergeant in 1964, lieutenant in 1969, captain in 1971, major in 1973, lieutenant colonel in 1974, colonel in 1975, and commissioner in 1984. Bishop Robinson was also a major part and representative from the city of Baltimore in founding NOBLE, a national organization of African American police officers from various American cities in 1976. For Robinson's first 14 years in the department until 1966, African American officers were quarantined at rank, not allowed to patrol in white neighborhoods, and barred from the use of squad cars during a time period where civil rights movement, Vietnam War, and Black Power movements took place. Robinson was elevated to the command of commissioner in a department long dominated by Irish American officers and briefly dominated by Italian American officers, as a means of giving African American officers control of the department as Baltimore City became solidly majority African American, which it still is today. While the Baltimore Police Department never really had any light shed on the discrimination that was executed by their officers, on April 12, 2015, an arrest of a man named Freddie Gray was really eye-opening to the city. Freddie Gray was a 25-year-old black man. He was arrested by the Baltimore Police Department for possessing what the police alleged was an illegal knife under Baltimore law. While being transported in a police van, Gray fell into a coma and was taken to a trauma center. He died on April 19th, 1 week later, and his death was ascribed to injuries to his spinal cord. 2 days later, on April 21st, a pending investigation of the incident, 6 Baltimore police officers were suspended without pay. The commissioner at the time, Anthony W. Bates, reported, contrary to department policy, the officers did not secure him inside the van while driving to the police station, which is a policy that had been put into effect 6 days prior to this arrest, following the review of other transport-related injuries. The medical investigation found that Gray sustained his injuries while in transport, and a medical examiner concluded that Gray's death could not be ruled an accident and was actually ruled a homicide because the officers failed to follow safety procedures, quote, through acts of omission. This led to wild rioting, looting, and even a curfew to be implemented in the city of Baltimore for 2 weeks, where the National Guard had to be called in because of this police brutality. This ultimately led to the Baltimore Police Department asking the Department of Justice to investigate their police department on brutality and unlawful acts by their officers. The Department of Justice investigation found a couple things that I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. The main points of the investigation that was launched again by the request of the Baltimore Police Department in 2016 found that there were 1. Unconstitutional practices against African Americans being executed by the Baltimore Police Department. 2. Disproportionate rate of stops, searches, and arrests of African Americans from the police department. 3. Excessive use of force against juveniles. And 4. Excessive use of force against people with mental health disabilities. To get a little more specific into some of the statistics and just how discriminatory the Baltimore Police Department had been acting from 2010 to 2015, what the report found that there were 11,000 charges that were rejected by prosecutors for lack of probable cause against African Americans during this 5-year period. Between 2010 and 2016, 95% of the 410 individuals that were stopped 2 or more times by Baltimore police departments were African American. The report also noted that officers recorded more than 300,000 pedestrian stops from January 2010 until May 2015. Roughly 44% were made in 2 small, predominantly African American districts that contain only 11% of the city's population. And 7 black men were stopped more than 30 times each in this 5-year period. Black pedestrians were 37% more likely to be searched by Baltimore police citywide and 23% more likely to be searched during vehicle stops. But officers found contraband twice as often when searching white residents during vehicle stops, and 50% more often during pedestrian stops. In Baltimore, a city that's 63% black, the Justice Department found that 91% of those arrested in discretionary offenses like failure to obey or trespassing were African American. Blacks made up 60% of Baltimore drivers, but account for 82% of traffic stops. Now I'd like to talk about the communication barriers that may have caused this discrimination that was found in the Department of Justice report of 2016 into the discrimination of the Baltimore Police Department. And I really want to conscious on 2 barriers, which is both conscious and unconscious bias. Now, you might think that conscious bias is pretty obvious with the majority of police commissioners, the history of segregation in our company, as well as Baltimore being one of the biggest cities throughout this country's history. But not only were police officers, both Caucasian and African American, biased towards the African American population, but they were also extremely unfair to the treatment of prostitutes and transgenders, doing things like making them the victim, asking the victims of crimes that call for their assistance if they were leading certain men on, and this is why they got it. It is very discriminatory practices that has caused the downfall of part of this department. But the real one I want to talk about here is the unconscious bias, because many people would think that all of this discrimination comes from white or Irish or Italian officers on the black community, but that's not necessarily true. Unconscious bias talks about stereotypes, sexism, racism, discrimination, and prejudice that all come from communication and not from studying the world around us. In 2015, out of the 2,700 active duty police officers in the department, 1,445, more than half, were African American, Hispanic, Asian, or Native American, according to data provided by the Baltimore Police Department for the Daily Caller News Foundation. 4 of the department's top 6 commanders were either African American or Hispanic. More than 60% of the incumbents at the highest command levels hail from minority communities. Among the 46 Baltimore police officers who hold the rank of captain or above, 25 of them are from ethnic or racial minority groups, which constitutes for 54% of the command leadership. What I'm trying to portray here is that the discrimination in the Baltimore Police Department did not only come from people of the other race, it actually came mostly from people of African American or minority races, just based solely on an unconscious stereotypical bias. After the Justice Department investigation, things did not necessarily clear up. The commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department was in charge of a gun task force that was found in 2018 to have committed extremely unlawful practices such as stealing, drug dealing, and planting evidence on victims. So when I talk about solutions for the Baltimore Police Department, there will still be people that will corrupt the system and discriminate, but the majority hopefully will follow these solutions. One being data collection and analysis, including reviewing, updating policies, and training. This will ensure that officers' actions conform to legal and constitutional requirements, which obviously the DOJ investigation did not see in the Baltimore Police Department. Another thing that I would suggest is technology and infrastructure changes. Right now, about 75% of all Baltimore police officers are equipped with body cameras. I would like to up that to 100%, which effectively monitors all officer activity and can stop events like the Freddie Gray death in 2015 from happening. New types and expanding of officer support programs. Right now, the Baltimore Police Department only has a couple licensed therapists and mental health experts on their staff, and that is used as for the city and not directly for the department. I would like to expand that program to about a dozen, maybe more, based on the amount of officers that are willing, and make sure that all officers attend at least one session per 6 months. And then community policing strategies. Rebuild relationships between the Baltimore Police Department and the various communities. Get the police department out on the streets in things like charity events and cookouts and community events that are not all associated with a bad stigma of a police officer. This will gain trust in the communities, especially the lower income communities, which has had such a bad history with the police department over the last couple of decades. But how do we get these solutions to work? It all starts at the top. The collaboration between the Baltimore Police Department and the mayor's office is the way to start all of these practices and solutions and get them out into the streets. We will need a more extensive new hire training and continuous education courses throughout the police department, which will make officers get recertified and or re-educated or educated in general on all policies for both Baltimore City and the United States Constitution. Two things that all officers must be constantly reminded of, and that leads into biannual officer reviews. With the implementation of body cameras on all officers, you will be able to know what every officer is doing and give consequences when body cameras are not on, or if officers do not know their duties. This biannual officer review will include all rankings all the way up to the top, all the way to the police commissioner, down to on-traffic officers. With these solutions, hopefully we will be able to keep a grasp on the discrimination or lack thereof in the future of the Baltimore Police Department. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you take these into consideration.